In April of 1974, a couple in their early 20s was asleep in their home in Sacramento, California when they were awoken by a noise in their kitchen. What they didn't know was that this noise would change their lives forever. They called the police, but the criminal was already gone. But he would strike again and again and again. And for over a decade, the police were completely baffled. It would take decades and a revolutionary new technique before the man would finally be caught. But how? Let's take a look at the case of the Golden State Killer. This case takes place in California in the 1970s and early 1980s. It was a time of peace and love and, well, disco music. But there was one big problem: a monster amongst us. That monster was a serial rapist and murderer who went by many names. He was known as the East Area Rapist, the Visalia Rapist, the Original Night Stalker, and the Golden State Killer. But his real name was Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo started his career in 1965 when he became a police officer in the town of Auburn. His career was going great until one day he was arrested for spousal battery. After this, he lost his job as a cop, but this didn't stop him from becoming a security guard. In fact, he worked at the same university that his wife attended. So it wasn't long after this that he was back in the good graces of society. But what he would do next would shock the world. On March 13, 1974, he would go on his very first crime spree. He went on a mission to terrorize the state of California. That night he broke into the home of Brian and Katie Majori. They were a young couple who had just moved into their dream home. But now they would never be able to sleep in their bed again. That night, DeAngelo broke in through a window. The couple woke up and called the police, but when they arrived, the burglar was gone. The only thing that he left behind was his scent. This would actually be the last time that the police would ever get so close to catching him. He would strike again and again, mostly targeting young couples in their homes. When he broke in, he would tie up the men and then assault the woman. There was no rhyme or reason to any of his attacks. He struck in both rural areas and the suburbs. At first, the police thought that he was always using the same mode of transportation because he always seemed to strike around the same time. But later on they would realize that he had been driving a different car each time. By December of 1974, the police had linked the assaults to the same guy. At this point, they had no idea that he was a former police officer. Because of his knowledge of police procedure, he was always able to stay one step ahead of them. In fact, the police got so frustrated that they actually put a reward on his head. By January of 1975, 1,000 people had come forward claiming to have seen the perpetrator. Unfortunately, none of these tips panned out. On February 2, 1975, he did something that he hadn't done on any of his other missions. He killed. That night he broke into the house of Robert Offer and his wife, Mark. He tied them up with electrical cords and then shot them. They were found the next morning by their daughter who had come to visit. This is when the police realized that they were dealing with a monster. In the coming years, he would strike again and again. One time he even taunted the police by leaving behind a pair of women's underwear. All of his crimes were linked together, yet he remained one step ahead of the police. Eventually, they gave up on finding him. But little did they know that he would strike again in the 80s. From 1980 to 1986, he continued his reign of terror. In total, he would be responsible for 12 murders, 50 to 100 rapes, and over 120 burglaries. The police still don't know the true extent of his crimes. To this day, many victims have come forward saying that they are almost positive that he was responsible for their assault. But by 1986, he had seemingly vanished into thin air. To this day, the police are not sure why he stopped. Maybe he got scared or maybe he just got bored. Whatever the reason, the police were happy to have a break. But unfortunately, they wouldn't have much time to rest. From 1980 to 1986, there were 2 serial killers active in the United States. The other one being Ted Bundy. This man was a psychopath who got off on the fear that he instilled in people. It was later revealed that Bundy had confessed to over 30 murders, but he may have killed as many as 100. The police knew that they were dealing with a madman, which is why they wanted to catch him more than anyone else. Finally, on January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Now that the police no longer had to worry about Bundy, they could focus all of their attention on the Golden State Killer. But this wouldn't be easy. They had nothing to work with. All they had was a profile that said he was most likely married with children. But there were hundreds of thousands of married men with kids in California, so the search would take a while. It would take 27 years before the police finally made a breakthrough. But when they did, it would be because of an obscure type of genetic testing. Let me explain. At the time, the only way that you could be tested for DNA was by getting a sample from the person directly. But the police had no idea where the Golden State Killer was. So they needed to find a way to test his DNA without having him present. So they did something crazy. They went to crime scenes where body fluids had been left behind. Using some very sophisticated equipment, they were able to extract a few dozen cells. With this, they took it to a private company called Cellmark, which was one of the only companies in the nation that could run DNA tests. But they were only able to come up with a partial profile. But what they did have was enough to link all of the crimes to the same individual. At this point, the police were worried that their investigation had hit another dead end. But then in 2018, a breakthrough would finally happen. The reason for this was because of a new field of genetic science known as genetic genealogy. The way that it works is simple. If you get a DNA sample, it can be compared to public databases of people who have willingly given up their own DNA. If the DNA sample is from a crime scene, the investigators will see if it matches anyone in the database. If they do, then they can start to build a family tree. They then compare the family tree of the victim to the family tree of the suspect. If they match at certain points, then it means that they are related. At this point, it's just a matter of figuring out which one is the killer. This new technology would lead the police right to Joseph James DeAngelo. As it turns out, he had a son and a grandson who had willingly given up their DNA. Once they learned that he was the prime suspect, they set up a stakeout at his house. After observing him for a bit, they decided to arrest him. When they searched his house, they found plenty of evidence that linked him to the crimes. In fact, one of his neighbors had given them a tip 40 years ago, but the police had never followed up. I guess you could say that this guy really was a golden ticket to solving one of America's most heinous crimes. After arresting DeAngelo, the media went crazy. Headlines blared from every newspaper. The police had finally caught the Golden State Killer. Even though he was 72 years old at the time of his arrest, he still seemed to be in pretty good shape. But once he was put in jail, he quickly aged. He is currently serving 27 life sentences and will never get out. One of the things that made this case so interesting is that we will probably never know what caused this man to go on such a violent crime spree. Some experts say that he was born evil. Others say that he was driven insane by the stress of losing his job. Whatever the reason, this man's legacy will live on forever.